Here we go. In 155 AD, during a time of intense persecution, a man named Polycarp was arrested, and he was brought before the Roman authorities. They demanded he renounce his faith and worship the emperor, but Polycarp refused. Even when threatened with torture and losing his life, he remained steadfast in his commitment to Christ. On the day of his removal, Polycarp was brought to the stadium. There was a large crowd that had gathered to witness his unaliving, and when the Roman authorities tried to force him to renounce his faith, he famously declared, 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And despite this powerful testimony, the Roman authorities ordered his removal by burning at the stake. The loss of Polycarp became a powerful symbol for many centuries of Christian martyrdom, and his legacy has continued to inspire many Christians for centuries. His steadfast faith and his willingness to suffer and pay the ultimate price for his beliefs serves as a reminder of the deep cost of discipleship and the importance of remaining faithful to Christ, even during difficult times. At the end of his life, he was not afraid. He was faithful, even until the loss of his life. I bring up martyrdom because it becomes clear as our story continues, and as we're diving into Revelation chapter 13, that there will be a future empire and a future ruler who is going to attack God's people. We're already seeing that in certain parts of the world today. Just looking at the news recently, I'm reminded that there are many Christians out there who are paying the ultimate price for their faith, and that we are called to stand strong, even in difficult times. As we look at even the area over where ISIS is taking control, there's a growing call for renewed caliphate in that region. And that more than 1,000 Christians have been unalived in the past few weeks, including women, children, and priests, solely for their beliefs. On average, there's about 12 Christians a day who lose their life for the testimony of Jesus. And this is going to continue to increase as we move forward in our study of the end times. In fact, in this next chapter, we'll read in verse 7, it was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. What is this it that's listed in the verse? And this is this future world beast, this future empire and world ruler who we're going to be talking about a little more today. And we've already established that God's holy people is more than just Israel and the Jewish nation. This is Christians, those who believe in Jesus Christ. It is also those who declare their allegiance, that Jesus is not only their Savior, but he is their King. And so there will be a future time of testing and trial coming for God's people. And like Polycarp, we're called to remain bold and to not deny Christ when challenged. Because Jesus even told us in Matthew 24, and we covered this in several podcasts, he said that in the end, many will turn away. May that never be us. And so, as I said, we're starting out in Revelation chapter 13 finally this week. And this chapter, like many others, is full of symbols and language that we need to dive in today to try to fully understand it. What we'll discover is it's directly aligned with the book of Daniel. So we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel several times in this conversation. And therefore, before we get started, I wanted to take a look at a couple of passages from Daniel to help give us some perspective. And the first one's pretty long, but hang tight as we muddle through it. Daniel 7, starting in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came out of the sea. The first was like a lion. It had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being. and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that had looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. And after that, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all other former beasts, and it had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like a human being and mouth that spoke boastfully. Okay, so in this vision, we're given 4 beasts that come out of the waters. The waters are often represented as the Gentiles people in Scripture. So these are Gentile beasts that arise. There's a lion, there's a bear, and there is a leopard. Then there's this indescribable, terrible beast that Daniel can't fully give an explanation of. They have 4 heads, 10 horns, 11th horn grows up out of it. Now, this isn't the only time we've seen this sort of imagery. Daniel chapter 2 is another passage I want to look at. In verse 31 it says, "Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. And while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken into pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain that filled the earth." So what we see here then is 4 kingdoms. And yet Daniel kind of describes it like there's 5 here. We'll talk about it here in a second. He says the iron with the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and become like chaff on the flesh or in the threshing floor. But later he says, in verse 4, he says, "Finally there will be a 4th kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. And as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay." So there's this final empire that is of iron, but it's a divided kingdom. It has 10 toes made of iron and clay, and he says this kingdom will partially be strong and partially be brittle. Like this is a separate kingdom, but somehow it's still connected with that 4th kingdom of iron. We're told that these 10 toes are parts of this 5th kingdom. It says, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to other people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." So just to give some context and some interpretation here, you've got Nebuchadnezzar's dream describes the series of kingdoms from man's perspective. This sequence shows a downward trend from gold on down to iron. So, in some senses, they get weaker, but the strength grows stronger, or they'll be less brilliant, but they become stronger, even meaner as they go along. And in both visions, they're ultimately destroyed by God, not humankind. This requires divine intervention. Now, these kingdoms, there are varying interpretations as to which empires these four kingdoms represent. It gets even more confusing later when we're told that there are 7 kingdoms. We go to Revelation chapter 17, verse 9. It says, "This calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills in which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when it does come, it must remain for only a little while." So we must use some perspective here. Daniel is interpreting a dream that starts with him in his time period. And at that time, Babylon is the largest empire. If 7 kingdoms will exist, he is starting around the 3rd kingdom that existed during the time. So John in Revelation notes that 5 kingdoms have fallen, however 1 is. And we have to ask, what kingdom existed in John's time? Well, we don't have to guess at that. He existed in the Roman Empire. Rome then, according to this prophecy, is the 6th kingdom. 1 more kingdom remains. And we have to ask, is that the kingdom of iron and clay? Somehow separate, but part of the iron of the terrible beast. What Gentile kingdoms have existed then? If we're talking about 7 kingdoms, what kingdoms have existed? And then we have to step back even a little bit further, saying, keep in mind, this is always a story of Israel. The Bible is focused on Israel and the Middle East. So what empires have had control and been an influence in the land of Israel in the past? Well, we know right away that Egypt, for instance, is where the story of Israel began, but also the Egyptian Empire ruled over the area of Israel from 1500 to 1200 BC. They would also later take control of this area as part of the broken up Ptolemaic Empire and Greece, competing back and forth with the Seleucid Empire for control of this region. There would be sort of this tennis match back and forth as to who would own this area of Israel. After that would come a very large empire called Assyria, which would conquer the northern kingdom of Israel around 722 BC and take them off as slaves. After that would be the Babylonian Empire, which would finish off the rest of Israel by conquering the southern kingdom of Judah. They would destroy Jerusalem and the temple. They too would take back captives and prisoners to Babylon. This is the time of Daniel's vision. It is the time of captivity for Israel. He is a Jewish captive in Babylon. After that, they would be conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. They would conquer them, but we would largely know them as the Persian Empire in history. Following them, the Greeks would defeat the Persians under Alexander the Great. Now, during this time, they did not conquer Jerusalem. We covered that in another podcast. Alexander allowed Israel to survive due to the prophecies that pointed to him as a future world ruler. But Jerusalem did become part of that Greek Empire, and that Greek Empire would eventually split into 4 parts, thus the imagery of 4 heads and 4 wings. Following that would be the Roman Empire. This is the empire during John the Apostle's day. It was the Iron Age beast that he could not describe. Therefore, what that means is there leaves 1 remaining. If it was the 6th, then what's the 7th? And many people have lots of ideas as to what this is. And there have been some powerful empires since Rome. But we have to follow the pattern of what we've seen with these statues and with these beasts, with the empires. These are groups of people who have occupied the Holy Land and God's people. Each kingdom typically follows right behind the other. In other words, one tends to conquer the next and take their place. So we have to ask ourselves, who conquered Rome? And if we're being honest, most people believe Rome fell in 476 AD. And in fact, the city of Rome fell in 476 AD. But we have to ask the tougher question, does that mean that's when the Roman Empire fell? And the reason is because it's taught in most history books that Rome as an empire fell in 476 AD, and this is kind of mostly due to the fact that we tend to have a European, Western-focused worldview in our part of the world. And we fail to realize that that was only the western part of the Roman Empire that fell. Remember, the imagery on the statue is this was a split empire. And indeed, we know from history that the Roman Empire was divided into the Western and Eastern Roman empires in 395 AD. It was after the death of Emperor Theodosius I. He left the empire to his two sons. Rome was the capital in the west. Byzantium became the capital in the east. Because Rome had become so large and so vast as an empire, this would help them manage the empire and maintain it by having two separate capitals. Now, Byzantium, we would know later, would be called Constantinople after the Emperor Constantine revived it. It's also later known as Istanbul after the Muslims conquered Constantinople. The eastern part of the Roman Empire would continue on for nearly 1,000 years past the fall of the Western Empire. It fell on May 29, 1453, when Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Turks, the Islamic Caliphate, which in 1534 would take over completely, and this would be the Abbasid Caliphate. The Ottoman Caliphate, however, was then abolished in March 3, 1924. This would have been the end of the Ottoman Empire, which was then replaced by what we know as modern-day Turkey. And what you do need to know is that there is a desire